Well, we've been seeing in the logical reasoning section of the solutions to the free LawPrep that the logical reasoning section primarily tests you on your ability to understand an argument. What makes this video particularly interesting is that in this video, we will be dealing with the questions wherein the argument is presented to you in the form of a dialogue. In the problems that we'd be seeing in this video, you'd find that a statement or an argument is made by a certain person, and then you see a response by another person who may be either agreeing, disagreeing, or partly disagreeing. Let's have a look at these questions and understand this type of problems.
Right now in this video series, I've told you that we're looking at the type of questions that relate to dialogues, so you're already oriented. But when you're giving the exam, I urge you to first spend a couple of seconds skimming through the problem so that you come to know as to what the problem type is. Okay, so when you look at this problem, make sure that you give one look at it, the entire problem, in around 3 to 5 seconds, so you know what kind of a problem it is. So you can see here that there's something said by Saloni, there's something said by Taruna. And then it says that Taruna responds to Saloni by, which means Taruna is responding to Saloni. Okay. And what does she do? She's pointing out evidence, demonstrating alternative hypothesis. Okay. So now you are supposed to see what Taruna is doing in response to Saloni. Okay. This gives you a certain sense of direction before you begin. Remember, simply walking onto the field, knowing not where you have to go is not going to help you. Okay, so you start off by giving yourself some direction, and then we'll look at these and then advance to the options. Let's go ahead. Right, so Saloni says, last year my rose bushes produced very few blossoms. Okay, very few flowers. This year I used more fertilizer and she had more flowers. Okay, then she says, clearly then, very important words. I told you why. Okay, it says, clearly then, in order to bloom well, my rose bushes need more fertilizer than they got last year. Okay, then Taruna says, this year's weather was better for roses than last year's was, so your bushes would probably have bloomed well this year even without the extra fertilizer. Okay, what is the conclusion in Saloni's argument here, or whatever Saloni is saying? You see, words such as clearly, then, thus, etc. indicate the conclusion to you. Okay. Likewise, when you're looking at what Taruna has said, what is Taruna's conclusion? Okay, and that you can see by words such as so, whatever is following so, therefore, thus, clearly. These words indicate the conclusions. Okay, now when you look at the conclusion of Saloni and you look at the conclusion of Taruna, do you see agreement between them or do you see disagreement? Remember that in these problems, when you have two people talking, it is not necessary that there will be disagreement. There could be agreement, right? But you'd find more often than not that there is disagreement, but it is not necessary. To be able to first identify whether these two are in agreement or not is a good starting point. It lends you some perspective. So look at the conclusion of Saloni. Saloni is clearly saying that they need more. It says they need more fertilizer to bloom, right? That's what Saloni is saying here. Okay, and then when you look at what Taruna is saying, Taruna is ultimately saying that they would have bloomed even without the extra fertilizer, basically pointing towards the fact that they don't need more fertilizer to bloom. Okay, so there's disagreement as far as the conclusion is concerned. Okay, right, let's do this in a little detail now. Saloni talks about the last year and about this year. Last year, Saloni says there were less blossoms. This year, more fertilizer, and then there was also more blossoms, and therefore her conclusion is that these blossoms are because of the fertilizer, and therefore she concludes that, hey, they needed more fertilizer than last year to blossom. Now, Taruna refutes and disagrees with the conclusion, right? And she says probably they wouldn't have needed more fertilizer to bloom, because she says that, you know, your explanation is about this year is not so right, because she says that the reason, Saloni's explanation, is that, well, it's not probably the the fertilizer, but actually the weather, right? So she provides an alternative explanation by saying that, hey, it was maybe the weather. So she's providing a new explanation and a new reason. Okay, so her response is to basically disagree with the conclusion by providing a different explanation. So basically, Taruna is providing a different explanation for the observation of Saloni, right? Now that you have this with you, pick the option that resembles this the most. Okay, let me give it to you. The answer, as you can see very clearly, is C. Once you've got this thinking clearly, you can see that the answer is actually quite evident. She's providing an alternative hypothesis, a different explanation, to account for the difference in the outcome that Saloni describes. So the difference in outcome is basically the increased blooming. So she's providing a different explanation for it. So let's once again quickly acquaint ourselves with the question. You can see something said by Krishna, something said by Lakesh, and then it says that Lakesh's argument. So Lakesh is making an argument. Okay. Proceeds by putting evidence in new light, questioning data collection, age boundaries, presupposition. Okay. So I've given myself an idea, okay, of what's happening in here. This is very important. I spent 5 seconds, but those 5 seconds give me a lot of clarity on what I'm required to do. Now, let us do this in some detail. So Krishna says that adult children in Europe are neglecting their parents, okay? And then he goes on to say that of adults who have a living parent, 97% have no parent, and of these, only 3% recently provided physical care for a parent. Now, when you look at what Krishna is saying, can you spot the conclusion? The conclusion is the first line where he's saying that, hey, adult children are neglecting their parents. You can see Krishna's opinion right there. It's his conclusion, okay? And then what do you see here? He's kind of giving an explanation for this. He's giving some statistics as evidence. Okay. Next, let's see what Lakesh says in response. We know that this is an argument, and we are to assess in this question as to what he is doing in this argument. He says, if 97% do not have a parent, then 3% do, and this is a kind of physical care, so this figure should be added to them. He's talking something on the lines of some statistics about the statistic given here. Okay. He says the result is not disturbingly low, since most adults need physical care only for a few years at the end of their lives. Moreover, many parents have several children, and if one provides for physical care, there might be no need for another one to do. Now, even though I have not paid so much attention to this part yet, which is where some of you might get a little confused. Of course, I will do this in detail in a bit, but as of now, we've only been able to see this as something statistical, okay? And you will see that solving the question doesn't really require to understand the math so much. Can you see that what Lakesh is doing in here is that he's kind of saying that the result is not disturbingly low, right? He's giving his opinion here. You can see here like how that in this entire thing here, you can see the opinion of Lakesh. And the opinion of Lakesh is his conclusion. Okay. So when you see the first line, he's kind of analyzing Krishna's statistics in some ways, doing something on that. Maybe it's too complex for us to understand, but I just know he's doing something on that. Then he goes ahead and provides his conclusion that, hey, Krishna says that, you know what, they're neglecting. But here he says, maybe not. Maybe they're not neglecting. It's not so bad. And he gives a couple of more details. Here he says, he gives something more here, physical care, few years. So he's giving a little more explanation on why the stats are not so bad. And then he goes on to provide a little more explanation, stating as to why this percentage is not so disturbing. Even without getting into the details of what has been said here, you can kind of see that what Lakesh is basically doing is that he is looking at the statistics given by Krishna, and while Krishna uses these statistics to say that it's a sorry situation regarding parents in Europe, Lakesh uses the same statistics to say that, hey, it's not really that bad, it's not really that disturbing. So what we basically saw was that Lakesh is taking the statistics shown by Krishna and interpreting them differently to show that the situation is different from what Krishna thinks it is. Once you just understand this much, and if you look at the options here, you can find that the right answer is really simple to pick. The answer quite obviously is A. Now, just for the sake of explaining the question to you and explaining the statistics to you, I'll do that. But I want you to understand as to how irrelevant it is as far as getting the answer correct is concerned. Okay, so it says here that he says of adults, what Krishna is saying is here that of adults who have a living parent, 97%, so if you have these kids, so let's say you have children, okay, he says 97% have no parent living with them, okay, and he's so basically only 3% have some parent living with them, okay. And then he says out of these, which means out of these 97%, only 3% of this 97% provided for physical care, which means that, you know what, only most of them do not have a parent living with them, but out of these 97, 3% provided for physical care, okay. Now Lakesh says, he says, look, if 97% do not have a parent living with them, then 3% do. This is what that 3% is. These are the 3% that have a parent with them. And this is a kind of physical care. So this should be added to those who provided other physical care. So he's saying that, hey, if the parents are living with them, it means they're giving physical care. So he says you should add it to this. So he's saying 3 plus 3 according to Lakesh. Lakesh says, hey, this should amount to actually 6%. According to Lakesh, is 6%. And then he says the result is not disturbingly low. He says since most adults need physical care only for a few years at the end of their lives. So he says that, hey, if 6% of the kids are helping out their parents, and you know, people need help only for a short while in their lives, 6% doesn't look so bad. And then he says, moreover, many parents have several children, right? So let's say somebody has 5 children, okay? And let's say the parents are with only one of them. So both parents are with one kid, and 4 of them don't have them. Still, the parents are getting their care. But if you look at the percentage, you know, it's 1 in 5, 20%. So he's saying that the fact that parents might have many children adds to his hypothesis, adds to his conclusion that the results are not so bad. This is another story, okay? You can waste your time engaging in these things in the exam, but I want you to see that getting the answer right doesn't require you to get into this kind of maths, okay? When you see a question in the LSAT India, given the amount of time that you have roughly a little over a minute to solve the questions. Obviously, you're not required to do such kind of computation. This is the advantage of practice. Once you practice, you learn that not every detail really needs to be latched onto. You can solve the questions sometimes even without looking at the details. Let us go ahead. Right, that new question. This time, let us also try to build speed. What I advise you is to pause the video. Spend not more than 5 seconds skimming through the entire problem, which means that you look at the whole thing in around 4 to 5 seconds. In this, don't be too ambitious. Just try to identify around 10 words somewhere around here that kind of let you know what is happening. Then spend another 5 to 10 seconds understanding the structure and the requirement of the problem. Then take not more than say 45 seconds to pick your right answer, and then proceed to watching the solutions that we have on the other side of this. So pause the video, try it by giving yourself these strict timelines. You'd see as to how you perform when you give yourself the restrictions of time. Okay, let us go ahead with the solutions now together once you've done this. Okay, so when you look at the question statement, it is very obvious from here that Tanya is rejecting Manish's view, which means definitely there's disagreement here. So that's not the point. What you're looking to do here is to see as to how Tanya is doing that. What is the method that she is using to reject Manish's view? Okay, let's go ahead and see what it is. So what you can see here first is that Manish has spoken 5 sentences here, whereas Tanya has just 1 sentence, okay? And Tanya is rejecting Manish's view in there. So what I'd like to believe is that she's likely to be rejecting something in particular. So you have 5 sentences here, and maybe she's rejecting one of those, okay, or maybe 2 of those, because it's kind of hard to reject every single line in there. Let us start off by seeing as to what Manish is saying. So Manish says in the first sentence that nature is becoming irreversibly unpredictable because of human intervention. So he says that human intervention is resulting in nature becoming unpredictable. Then he goes on to say that rainfall, temperature, floods, the round of seasons, the content of air and water at the remotest parts on the globe have all been changed by human action. So he says that human action has resulted in a change in many aspects of nature. Then he says nature has always been distinct from humanity, which means that he's saying that, hey, there's nature and then there's humanity, which is different. So this kind of like signaling a difference. So nature is distinct from humanity. Then he says, now the whole earth is a farm, a mine, a waste dump. So he's saying that human abuse, human misuse has resulted in making the whole of the earth a farm, a mine, and a waste dump. And then he says that nature is at an end. Now, what does Tanya say? Okay, so he says that nature is at an end, but an important point here is that he says nature is distinct from humanity. So when he says nature is at an end, that doesn't necessarily mean that humanity is also at an end. Just a little point that I added in here. Okay, now what does Tanya say? Tanya says, just 1 sentence here, she says that people are a part of nature, so whatever they do is natural. Now when you talk about people, that kind of points to humanity, right? So Tanya kind of, if she's refuting something, if she's rejecting something, it kind of has to do with the third sentence, because this is the third sentence where he talks about nature and humanity. So Tanya is kind of saying that they are not distinct because humanity or people are a part of nature. So whatever they do is natural, which means that there's nothing like human intervention. Now you intervene, like when someone intervenes, that's because someone is an outsider. But Tanya says that people are a part of nature and everything they do is natural. Now let us go ahead and see what she's done. When you allow yourself to be guided by the question statement, then it is very clear that we are focusing on Tanya's rejection of what Manish said, and Tanya's rejection is very specific. It is on the fact that Manish claims that humanity is distinct from nature, whereas Tanya does not believe so. She believes that people are a part of nature and that they are not so distinct. Now, you can see from the answer key that the answer to this is the option D. Okay, it says an alternative definition of a term. Now, I'd like to ask you, which term is this? Right? It says that there's an alternative definition of a term. I'd like you to write in the comments section as to what that term is. Now, what you can see here is that I'm not really spoon feeding you entirely. I want you to engage with the questions, participate, so you can let me know in the comments section. Let us move ahead. Okay, so give yourself a minute to attempt this by yourself first, and then we'll go ahead and solve it together. Okay, take a minute and try to solve this question by yourself, not more than a minute, and then we'll go ahead and solve this together. Alright, going ahead with the question together now, you can see from the question statement that it is asking you about what the point of disagreement is. So you can see that Mukti is saying something, Primal is saying something. It consists of quite a few sentences, and we are to identify as to where they are disagreeing, and that is the answer. Remember, if you stay focused on the requirement of the question, you will be able to identify the answer a lot more easily. Let me demonstrate my point. I'd like you to pay attention to the method. So for this conversation between Mukti and Primal, I have broken this down into the individual sentences. Now why I have done that is because the point of disagreement is likely to be in just 1 sentence, right? So it's not the entire speech that might be in disagreement, right? It's possible that there's one point, and therefore focusing on the individual sentences is a good idea. Let us do this in a little more detail now. Now, the first sentence by Mukti reads that laws requiring seatbelt use are an improper invasion of privacy. So basically, Mukti in the first sentence is saying that this law requiring the seatbelt is improper. She goes on to say, it should be up to the individual whether or not to wear a seatbelt, since only that individual faces the consequences of this decision. So she says that only the individual suffers, okay? A driver who is not wearing a seatbelt is no more of a threat to other persons on the road than a driver who is wearing one. So she goes on to say that, hey, you're not a threat to the others if you're not wearing a seatbelt. So this is kind of substantiating her point that it is an improper invasion of privacy because you're affecting the choice of the individual, and even if someone has not worn a seatbelt, he causes no harm to the others. Let's see what Primal is saying in response. Okay, so Primal says here that seatbelts clearly save lives and prevent injury, and society at large has a stake anytime an action may result in harm to one of its members. So what he says here first is that, hey, seat belts save lives, okay? And then he says that there is a societal duty towards members. So it's not about only individuals. Primal talks about a societal duty as well. He goes on to say also, an injury has consequences for more people than just the person who is injured, right? So here you can see that Mukti says that only the individual suffers, whereas what is said here is that it has consequences for more people than just the person who is injured. Many others are harmed indirectly, such as relatives and co-workers. So basically here you can see that he says others are also harmed. If you look at these sentences here, I think it's quite clear as to where the actual difference lies, where the disagreement lies. You see, Mukti is not saying here that seat belts do not save lives. Mukti simply says, hey, if you don't wear the seat belt and you die, only you suffer, you're not causing harm to anyone else. So whether to wear the seat belt or not is your choice. Primal says that, hey, when a person dies or when a person is injured, it's not just the person alone, but some others also who are harmed. The requirement of the question is to find the point of disagreement, and that is in who is responsible and who suffers. Mukti believes that it is only the individual, whereas Primal believes that it is the individual along with some others as well. Right, so after that elaborate discussion on this question and also all of what I've spoken in this video, I will now leave it to you to pick the right answer to this question. So I won't give you the answer, but let me give you a couple of pieces of advice. Let us say you've picked your answer and you want to ascertain whether the question has been answered correctly or not. Go attempt the free LawPrep mock test, right? This is what we are solving right now. Go attempt the test, and on the other side of that you will receive the answer key, tally your answer and see whether you are it right or not. The second thing that I'd like to tell you, not just for this question but all of the questions in the LSAT India, particularly the logical reasoning section, is to reflect on how important it is, how vital it is to stick to the requirement of the problem. As long as you remain aware of what the question requires of you, you will find that you will be able to ignore all of those things that are not so important as far as getting the right answer is concerned. So practice the art of staying focused and committed to the objective requirement of the problem. With that, I wish you all the very best. See you in the next lesson.